G'day. Welcome to People Per Place and our lunchtime conversations. How are you doing today, Darren?
Yeah, good. We've had our normal succession of glitches and the like, so it's good to have those, so we remain consistent.
That's it. Yes, this modern era of the internet and such, it still seems to be a dark science of getting connected on any particular day.
Absolutely. But the good thing is today is, as much as it is for other people to hear about our workshop and what they might be able to get out of it, it's also a chance for us to dive deeper into it ourselves and understand more about it ourselves, because we are going into new spaces, aren't we? So it's not like all the answers have yet been found. It really is this idea of becoming an apprentice to the mystery, which I heard Steve March talk about in the last week, and I think that's very poignant for where we are with the whole conversation.
Yeah, it's even by way of example, talking back to how mum and dad understand or comprehend what it is that I do. They've got a lot of mystery about it. They love my enthusiasm and passion and excitement, but still can't articulate what is People Purpose Place, which is someone who's close to me and for a number of years has been listening to this story, but still the idea is only emerging what it is that we do.
Yeah, I think emerging is a great word, actually. I think that explains a lot of what we go through at the whole process, is really this deepening and understanding in the first place, but also then, in our own journey, is also about that, deepening in the learning experiences as well as we roll on. So we can probably jump in if that makes sense.
Sounds good to me. Christine's been farnarkled by the internet gods, but hopefully she might be able to contribute in an online or a text message sense. So jump into the check-in?
Yeah, sounds great. So when I was actually going through the terms and stuff that we use, specifically when we're trying to introduce people to the idea of People Purpose Place, one of the challenges is the English language has a lot of complexities and nuances to it, and not always does it explain what we're trying to achieve, right? And even a lot of this stuff in the workshop gets barreled up in stuff. And it was Christine originally who separated the two terms, being the house and the home, and then trying to understand.
And Darren looks like he's frozen now, so the internet gods are doing the rounds. But trying to separate how we respond to these two words. The word house is perhaps front and center in all the headlines in media. We talk about houses, a number of houses and availability of houses, which seems to be quite a logic-framed response. Would that be fair to say? And then when we talk about home, it's quite a different feeling, and we have perhaps a more emotional response. And to my mind, and I don't know how this sits for you as a listener, but when we mention the word home, it feels more emotional, and we maybe think more about the relationships and interconnectability rather than the logic response. You back with us, Darren?
Yeah, that's absolutely. It's all happening today. So you were waxing lyrical while I was off in the internet.
I don't think anyone picked up. Yeah, I was seamless.
I had a beautiful presentation too. So I had it all sorted, and then I realised I was literally speaking to no one. So that worked perfectly. So where did I drop out? Did you hear the idea? Yeah, cool. So you probably answered part of this, but the point was when I started to really dive deep into this idea of what our workshop could be, one of the challenges we have is that the English language itself doesn't always clearly articulate what we're trying to communicate, you know? So we get locked in words and we struggle to understand them at times. And I think Christine highlighted this most when she was using these two terms interchangeably. And I thought I'd ask a two-part check-in question to highlight that disparity in between words that we probably use interchangeably, but have very different power when you isolate them. So the first question is, when I mention the word house, what do you think?
Yeah, and I mentioned that typically I come up with a logical answer. So I just start describing bricks and mortar and materials and roof and walls and things.
Yeah, and I think mine is pretty well the same. You know, when you talk about someone say, here's this house I just built, or come and have a look at my house, they're generally talking about an object, aren't they? You know, so they're talking about
how many square meters. Yep.
Correct. Now, that's a very different distinction to when you say, when I mention the word home, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, and for me, home, I think about relations and memories of intimate, you know, parental response, you know, relationships, and that safe and security, a warm, you know, a warm blanket on the couch on a rainy Saturday afternoon. It's a very emotive response, thinking about home. Sitting in front of the fire, those sort of responses.
Yeah, 100%. And I think even, you know, when you think about the two, and I sort of put them in there on purpose. I mean, housing is definitely about thinking. Being at home is definitely about feeling. So, and there is that distinctive, like, you know, even when I say those words, and I was listening to you talk about those things, there is a felt sense that goes with home. There isn't always a felt sense that comes with house. It's just a thing, right? Whereas a home is that place where you've had those experiences, where you built those relationships, where you have that sense of security and safety and all of those things, which may not actually be related to the physical building you're in. You know, it might almost be superfluous. So yeah, that's great. So today we were really going to dive into, and over the next couple of weeks, we're hoping offline, not in the podcast world, but in the real world or real digital world, or however you want to word that, that we were going to start to run our workshop series, which was called Difficult Conversations About Housing. And one of the things which we realized is that it's a very difficult conversation to even have a difficult conversation about housing. So we thought it would be worth introducing it in a bit more depth, because we found that it's not actually easy just for people to slide right into having a workshop about, you know, what housing alternatives might be out there. That in the first instance, we might actually need to talk a bit deeper about, you know, what could a conversation be about housing and what does that look like? So our intent today is to dive a little bit deeper into our future workshop system, and to start to unpack it so others might be able to easily understand it. So the first question I had to you is, do you think we need to be having difficult conversations about housing?
Absolutely. I think it's the one thing that we need to do more of, failing all else. There's not a budgetary thing. There's not a political thing. There's not a more houses thing that will fix this problem more than having difficult conversations. And the challenge with that is our society is not set up for difficult conversations at all. It's set up for headlines and sound bites and really micro bits of information. And enabling difficult conversations is a complete cultural change to how we approach housing today, which is fundamentally only an economic lens at which we look at the current housing marketplace. We just look at this purely from, as an economist might, and say there's so many houses, there's so many square meters, there's so many dollars per square meter, and affordable, not affordable, whatever, rules they want to apply. And nobody's having the conversation around what actually even is the purpose of housing. Why are we talking about housing? In the developed, wealthy nation that we are, is it acceptable to have estimates up to 450,000 people homeless?
Yeah.
I think these difficult conversations are a must for a starting point.
And I 100% agree with you. And I have pondered this in the last couple of weeks, is as we go deeper into the reality of the impacts of housing on individuals and groups and even the greater societal impacts that we're now able to join the dots to and say, okay, well, why is it that we have some of the highest rates of depression in the world in a country that would be perceived as being so comfortable? I think one of the challenging parts is we know the power that housing and homing, what they do as a part of that overall picture for our society. And the problem is not everyone wants to dive into those conversations, but it's now, I think, in our evolution in Australia as a society, I think we've now got to a point where it's no longer a conversation we can assume we need to have. We absolutely need to dive into this difficult area.
Yeah, I think the 4 decades of it continuing to escalate out of control has, maybe today is the critical mass, or the point at which we have to draw a line on the sand and say enough is enough. And I guess the other part is to say, when we have a difficult conversation to have, so if you can remember back when you busted up with a girlfriend, or a very emotional and challenging question, you try and set the scenes and you try and establish a safe space to have this conversation. We don't flippantly just walk in by this way saying, we're all over it, see you later, ta-da. Because that's not respectful to the relationship. It's not allowing that other person to feel safe and understood or heard. And I think we can absolutely set groundwork and a framework that having difficult conversations can be done in a respectful and open and as safe as possible, while still exploring challenging and difficult topics, which is the purpose of having the workshop process.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. And I thought we might unpack the discussions we've been having about almost like an introduction to the workshops, or why, the what's in it for me ultimately for the workshops. And I thought I might just start off with who we thought the workshop might be applicable to. So we feel like it's a runway for individuals, groups, possible already forming groups, ethical investors and philanthropists, organizations working in the area that's called the housing crisis, and those interested in the challenges of modern society and want to look at real solutions that can make stuff happen outside of that. Do you think that captures everyone who should come along and be inquisitive about the workshops?
Absolutely. I think that's the people who will identify with a cause that need to address the housing challenge. In reality, anyone who wants a better home outcome, and whatever you can imagine that to be, could absolutely learn from the process. But I think there's clearly as you've articulated there, a list of people who are front and centre, expected to do society's heavy lifting, that have been tasked with, this housing provider, say, go out there and do, I think the government's got this target of 30,000 social housings in the next 5 years. So this process isn't about social housing, but there are definitely people tasked with very specific roles to go and fix that. And unfortunately, the tools that we have been using for the last 40 years are the same tools they're using today. We'll throw more money at it. We'll make bigger promises. I made a bigger promise than the last bloke. Or we'll change regulation, or we'll magically make more homes. We'll tax people for having property vacant. All of these mechanisms are exactly the same tried and true mechanisms that we have used for the last 40 years. So we do need to have a different approach.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think also one of the things I realized when I was reading through that information is that I actually think, so we know that for people to get this conversation right, quite often you need to be exposed to it a little bit, right? So if you aren't exposed to it, then to some extent, if you've been historically benefiting from the current system, you're probably not aware of maybe the repercussions or the impact on the rest of it, of society. And that's extremely normal. Like, there's nothing good or bad or indifferent about that. If you're not impacted by it, it's highly unlikely all of us on the day-by-day basis are going, geez, it must be tough for a Ukrainian. Like, we hear it in the news, but we don't really know what that means, right? So, but I do think if you are outside of the existing system and you just want to be more aware of what you're operating in, I think this workshop, on top of the people who are like, we get the need basis, so I've really talked there about who actually need it or could benefit from it. But I also think there's another group of people, as you just alluded to, who maybe aren't aware of the system as it currently is set up, and maybe just to meet up eyes wide open. And that is even, my children, I hear their friends talking about, hey, we need to go and buy a house, and geez, rentals are expensive and all that sort of stuff. Now, even if you got a quarter of some of the crazy stuff that we dive into in the workshop, and it was even just the first 3 or 4 episodes, right? And you were just more aware of the world you were living in and the system of housing. And that is a system of housing we're talking about. We're not talking about a system of homing. How this system of housing works. And then you can make better decisions. Do I feel like I want to perpetuate silly, or am I going to perpetuate silly with my eyes wide open? Or what happens if I wanted to try something different? Is there an alternative out there? So I think there is an opportunity for other people just to come in and just be. And I had this conversation yesterday, and I think we've talked about these two terms a little bit. And again, we dive into these words, but I think they're important. There's a difference between curiosity and wonder, right? So this idea that, curiosity is about solving something. So I need to find out why this is. The other side of that is just your ability to feel intrigued and curious and all of these things without needing to definitely find the answer, which is about wonder. And I think in today's world, we spend so much time looking for the answer that we don't always just seek to be involved in and correspond with the message. So I hope that there's just some people who just jump in for the sake of enjoying it.
Yeah, absolutely. Better informed about the housing market is a vast influence on our society. And if you had better text, better comprehension, better understanding of what is, it's not going to disappear. This isn't going to replace the existing mechanisms and infrastructure. Hopefully, it will offer some people an alternative that delivers for them a great home. And that would be fantastic. It would be a great homes arising within existing neighbourhoods. And then existing neighbourhoods might be, 20 homes in the street that are all done with the existing infrastructure and mechanisms, and couples go and get $1 million mortgage and buy their house and build their house. Fantastic. That will continue. But within those streets and neighbourhoods, there's these intentional homes where people are being their best artistic household, or their best older women at risk of homelessness household, no longer at risk of homelessness. And they have this value inherent in them that offers to this neighbourhood that otherwise doesn't exist. If those 5 women reside in existing established mechanisms, they're constantly fearful, they're constantly being moved on at the end of each tenancy, and they can't be their best selves. Because they're not being their best selves, our community is poorer for it.
Mm. Yeah, you've got a very, I just wrote down some notes while you were talking there that, our goal really is to rehome Australia. Like that's, and it's not everyone's home. As you said, like the existing system is really as quite powerful in a lot of ways. And we know that we're living inside a society which is, controlled and directed by money. So that's quite okay. And we're not suggesting that these solutions are about, going off the grid and wearing a tinfoil hat. We're actually saying, what happens if you could be more engaged in society and more engaged with the other humans you are around and you want to be with? And could you deepen that experience while still respecting that you're a person and you need to have your own individual rights? So that's awesome. So the idea was for us to really dive a little bit into what could be the episode 0.5, which is about explaining to people, what's in it for me with this workshop. And I think what you said there is very poignant, that, one of the things that we keep coming back to is this idea that Charles Kettering had first put forward, which is a problem well stated is a problem half solved. And by extension, a problem not well understood is probably insolvable, which I think when you think about our housing problem, there is so much complexity in this.
Yes.
And that's the problem, is we might actually be solving the wrong issue. The government's out there using this statement of the housing crisis, and I'm not actually sure, it might be, but I'm not actually sure that that's our problem. And that's why the workshop is about that.
Yeah, very much so. And before, it's a 10 parts, 10 workshops to complete the full understanding. Yep. And we couldn't possibly run through all of that in a single hour. But if you set the groundwork and the rules for holding workshops, forming agreements, making safe spaces, and allowing people to come forward to start teasing out your own particular problem. Mm-hmm. So what is my version of the housing crisis? What does that look like for me? And is that in my eldership, I don't know what to do with this single property that can't house my 3 kids. How do I share that equitably amongst 3 of them? I've got this transition of wealth question. Now that might be very different to the young professional who's just completed their degree and got their first full-time employment in their chosen field, but a $1 million mortgage seems a bit excessive at 27. So, very different problems. Your housing crisis is quite different. And to start with, how do we feel safe enough and have space held for us to sit down and have this conversation with some understanding of the system? So I'm not having this conversation on my own with my peers who are also 27-year-old, just completed a degree in whatever that is, IT, not necessarily understanding the housing market. So having that space to sit down in a collaborative way, open and shared information, to build my knowledge to resolve my problem.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. I think you've touched a little bit on there that the workshop is the opposite to the current profit-driven thing-based model, which again uses the word house because that's attached to a thing, and we try and turn the system upside down and say, you know, a bit like the name of the people you're listening to, which is people, purpose, place. In that order, we turn away from the thing, which is the place, and we look at the people and the purpose before we move on to that place. Now, this actually, and I haven't discussed this with you at any other time, but I had a meeting with someone on Friday, and they were talking about some of the mechanisms that we potentially already have in our toolbox, right? So they were talking about this idea of, hey, I'm trying to find a way. I've got this gorgeous block that has this beautiful overview and looks in a cracking spot. And I see the need for having more people in the use of one site. I've considered units and I've considered all these things, but they just don't seem right. And I can't get the recovery and I have to go 3 stories and whatever. So, you know, is there an alternative way to have that conversation on the basis of, you know, putting, you know, more people in an area and have some level of collaboration? Now, there is, right? And we know there is because we've been working in this space for quite some period of time. But there was, and there still is dwelling within me, some level of reservation. And I was struggling to understand why that was. And the reason I came to was they were looking at this with a only financial lens. So the financial lens came first, and then it flowed through to the people, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to respond to that opportunity by saying, I don't think we have the right alignment. Now, that seems ludicrous. On face value, on all other ticks, you would say, hey, this makes sense. And I already see people going out there. I see investors trying to build these things. And, you know, Christine even shot an example through today where she said, oh, they're trying to think about this project up there where it's got, you know, we want more houses for disability services. The first unit I saw was on a sloping side with 2 stories.
Yeah.
This is not about people. This is about money, right? Yeah. So to me, they're just perpetuating more of the ridiculousness we already have as the million other examples. And the first stage is $4.5 million. They're just like, are we still doing this? And the answer is, of course, we're still doing this. So we need between us to hold each other accountable to the fact that some opportunities just aren't consistent with that philosophy of people first, then purpose, and then place. And if you miss that alignment, then this workshop's not for you. If you want to make money only, you've come to the wrong spot. We're not. That's
use the existing tools. Off you go.
Correct. Yeah. And there is a place for money. We understand that, and it needs to be part of this system, but it can't be first. If it's ever first,
it's not exclusive and it's not solely. Yeah.
Correct. So, so that's, you know, interesting that, you know, while we're talking about this, it does collide with some of those things. So we do want people out of the process, though. I've just written down a group of things because they go, well, what do I get out of going to this workshop? Well, we want to be able to, and we might just, for the sake of keeping things rolling, I'll read through this list and then we can sort of comment at the end. But the idea of understanding the process would be important. So you guys are proposing this idea of this different way of homing. What does the process look like? We then talk about this idea that individuals need to be honored. But in the same instance, if you're not an individual who's wanting to grow and be better, it's highly unlikely that you're going to be developed enough to then go into working with groups. And then group building and then looking at this idea of membership. So I might even pause there so you can add in some comments. So this idea of if this process does involve a group of people, the first step is you as a person. And then the second step is understanding how a group forms. And then membership is about galvanizing you and to some extent doing what we as humans always like to do, which is putting some order amongst the chaos, which is we need to understand what this group actually is and how it can be documented.
Who's our tribe and what's our common goals? And yeah, absolutely. I think the very fundamental part of the existing mechanism is it no longer is the realm of one individual going out and buying $1 million property. I've got an average income, which is $1,800 a week, is something in that order. And can you afford $1 million mortgage? No. Can you come up with 20% deposit? No. Well, then it's out of the realms of an individual. So it's no longer a sole person doing the current. And if you go to the regions, you might halve that. But still, a $500,000 mortgage is no mean feat, or $400,000 with a $100,000 deposit. How many people actually can achieve that individually?
Yeah, I mean, you've actually placed that, and I'll jump in there only because it's front of mind. You've actually highlighted something that is, we know we talked about, but I'd never really thought about it like this. I mean, we talked about this idea that, there's a lot of people who are coupling for the purpose of having enough serviceability to get a loan, right?
Yeah.
And the challenges with that. So to some extent, I mean, when the way you just put it there, to some extent, we're already having to form groups, right, to purchase a property. We just don't know about it, and we're doing it so organically that is coming with its own repercussions, which is divorce, it's financial stress, because we're almost saying, hey, well, you can't buy it by yourself. You need to go and form a couple because that gives you enough money to go and do that. And because you both have to work, it's probably unlikely you can raise your own children. But apart from that, the system seems to be excellent. So I think that's a very, very interesting point you've raised, is the fact that ultimately we're actually doing it as groups already, right? We just don't even know it.
Yeah. We're not being quite that explicit that, hey, a large, maybe a consideration in forming a couple and becoming married or de facto or living together is this ability to buy property. Well, if you've had that explicit, clear conversation, maybe then you've crossed all the necessary challenges. But I'm certain a large portion of that is completely implicit and unclear, leading to disastrous outcomes down the track for sure. Because we're seeing the arising of not intimate couples, but work colleagues having a mortgage together. So we're not even a romantic couple, but we both share the same employer. So our employer both goes broke, and we're both on the scrap heap in our squash court building enterprise. And now we're unemployable, and both of us are unemployable, and we don't have a romantic relationship. What chance of success?
Yeah,
I think some of these alternatives, and we see these alternatives being presented more and more as alternative ways, but we're not thinking through the holistic thing. We're just trying to get more names on the mortgage documents so we can fund the outright mortgage.
Yeah,
which is part of the problem. Definitely not the whole problem.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. So moving from this idea of being, developing the best person of you as a person, as an individual, then moving forward into the, recognition that group might be the way, and then how do we form a group, and how do we document that? The next one is getting into the real nitty-gritties, which is this idea of building a household. Familiar, we're using all these interchangeable terms to explain, but this idea that once you move past this membership thing and you have this idea that we need to have a purpose as a household, and maybe there's some sort of galvanizing understanding we have to form that, and to get into then the uncomfortable space of how do we sort out all these bits? How do we form this agreement that talks about stuff as much as, we know some of these, core button pushing is, how do we deal with pets, or how do we deal with personal space?
Yeah. But who takes the damn bin out each week? Like, really trivial small things escalate over time because it's a very intimate, and we're all in the same place together. So, yeah, what hours we keep and what's, reasonable time to play music out loud.
And I think, though, on top of the fact that there is all of those concerns and, hey, do we need to follow this and do we need to do that and all that sort of stuff, there's also a chance for enrichment, because I think you put it in one of the statements just recently about, this idea of, I'll have to find it so I can read it out exactly, but you've mentioned this idea about, the paradox of the wired world is that we are being connected electronically, but becoming less connected emotionally. So I think, I don't know, what book does that come from?
That's actually a Robin Sharma book I'm reading at the moment, which put me also onto the term about the same time, the concept of a cuddle party.
Yeah, I saw that at the top. That's pretty cool, isn't it? But isn't that intriguing that we are so unconnected that there is certain groups of society going, hey, we need to have a cuddle party?
Yeah, like, look it up. It blows my mind. But that's actually how we're responding to where our current society's got to. We'll go and network online for a stranger to meet for a hug.
It's filling a massive need, obviously.
Yeah. You can get endorsed as a cuddle party host, and away you go.
I might put it down my list of things to do. So moving on from the households, we obviously then move into, we've gone through this people bit, and then to some extent the household is about this purpose bit. And then we actually move into, well, once you've got all that right, we can now start talking about the thing that everyone else calls a house, which we call a home, which is, what does this project look like? And then how do you, if you've got a group of people, how do you develop a constitution or an understanding and an agreement on how this is going to work? And we know that these projects can take lots of different shapes and forms, can't they? Like, it's not about, hey, we're going to build this specific thing for you. It can be lots of different options.
Yeah, and I think that's actually the exciting part. Once we get to this stage of development of our group formation, household purpose, individuals group household purpose, we can find projects actually all around us. So they don't actually have to be, a spaceship technology and highly advanced and very refined set of skills to deliver. The actual trade and the household construction industry understands delivering projects really, really well. So whether they be new build or even repurposing and breathing fresh life into an existing home, it's actually really, really achievable and well understood. If you've done the groundwork and you built the foundations of agreements and enduring membership, then the actual project is falling off a log easy. You'll actually find it all around.
Definitely. And we've probably done lots of examples of the house bit, right, that can now be transformed into a home. So we've been throwing those examples out there as physical things, but it's not until you layer the human over the top. And I think the most exciting realization that we have actually understood is our role as people, purpose, place. Although it's about giving you some guidance and helping you go on this path, and that's what this workshop is about, is giving you the path, and you can wander off on that path, and we can help you on that journey. But we see the ongoing support and use of our toolbox as important lifelines that you can use regularly to then be able to say, okay, well, like all of us, we're going to have times when, at the moment my fitness regime makes sense. 6 months ago, I was 25 kilos overweight. So, we're all human, right? And I think this idea, and maybe Steve March would call it poetic attunement, but this idea of letting being okay says that at some point you'll need to go, oh, okay, well, that's no longer what I want to be. Who can help me to come back onto, and let's not call it the straight and narrow, because who knows where it's going, right? Like, let's just help me get a bit of a pull, a lifeline over into this other way. And we need some realignment. We need some tools. What's in that toolbox, and how can you help us?
And so I liken it as guideposts along your own path. And you can travel down the path at the pace, speed, development, when you're ready, at your own leisure. And the toolbox is the guideposts that you can avoid them completely and wander off entirely on your own and find yourself lost and say, I need some guidance whenever. I think there's probably some common sense to having an annual health check.
Yes.
Now that would probably be sensible to say, what are the agreements that we set out for this household? How are we abiding by those? What needs to be updated? What needs to be tweaked? We've decided to have pets, but not cats or dogs, but we've allowed reptiles and birds or whatever. Because we're human, right? We evolve, we develop, we change our needs from time to time. We are now greater beings than we were 12 months ago. So we now actually want this pet companionship thing in our home. So we don't have to be rigid and inflexible. We just need to say, okay, this is what we need to add and how to attune and to develop our guidelines. So that's perhaps an example of a guidepost along the way. Some of them will be the reading in the background. Some of the mentors and people that we've consulted in this journey have done PhDs in very specific, intentional communal living. How do we do agreements? How do we get unanimous agreement? And understanding sociocracy and all the available mechanisms. You don't need to be PhD level of understanding. You pick up from the guideposts sufficient for your journey on your path.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I actually will come to that in a minute, briefly, before we sort of try and wrap this up in the next 10 or 15 minutes. But But yeah, I mean, I think we started to talk about the idea of the introduction to the 10-part series, talk a little bit about why we created the series, highlight the scale of the issue, identify the complexity, provide a solution, and then, a little bit of what you just talked about then, explain why it took so long for us to develop this option. And it is just an option. And then to cover off the knowledge base and trust networks that are required to formulate where we are right now. And this will continue to evolve because obviously, as you said, as we continue to get more understanding of it, and we continue our apprenticeship to whatever that mystery is, that we stumble across this next bit of learning where we go, oh, okay, well, maybe polyvagal actually has some real basis and understanding of why we are feeling unsafe, and then how can we use our housing to help us feel more safe. And I think probably holding the conversation over of trust and knowledge works, I think we can probably hold that over to extend on the conversation with Christine, because I think for both of us, she has been one of those mentors which has helped us go, hey, here's a list of all the crazy things that I've learned. Maybe you guys should unfold some of that and have a look at it. And surprisingly enough, I started to expand on the list of reference materials or materials which might have actually impacted on this system. And like it's immense. There's an immense amount of materials which go to form the understanding and the reasons behind this. So one of the other things that we want to touch on is, you know, what People Purpose Place as the not-for-profit is and what it is not. Why do you think that's important?
Yeah, the housing crisis, for want of a better terminology, is so vast, and housing is such a fundamental for so many of us. I think this process and workshop and system can absolutely help almost everybody. But there are absolutely some people, for no fault of their own at the current point in time, have issues that are extreme and in need of social housing support. If you can't form agreements, if you can't make a weekly payment, you have health issues or addiction issues, then maybe you need to resolve those challenges as best you can first before this system is going to be able to help you. And there's absolutely a place that there should be a social housing response. So that's one compartment that this definitely is not. And governments have enormous budgets, and around the country there's 9 housing ministers in the country in various states who have budgets to address that, right? So let them do that.
Yeah,
I think almost for everybody else,
yes,
there is something available here.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think being explicit about that, and I think we had this conversation the last week, is even on our website. I mean, as soon as you talk housing crisis, most people are jumping to homelessness, right? And we absolutely are conscious of that, but we also are aware that if you are in a crisis moment, your ability to be able to, and everyone knows old Maslow's pyramid now these days. I think once upon a time it was only, the managers knew about this Maslow pyramid thing, but I think everyone these days goes, I get that I need the basics of life, and if I don't have the basics of life, then it's unlikely I'm going to jump forward to be, being a dynamic person in a group or forming agreements regularly. And so we acknowledge that, and we say that if you are in that situation where your basics of life aren't provided for, look after that first. Don't come to us to be a solution for that. All of us humans are broken on some level, but if you're at a point where you don't feel safe, you don't have the basics of life, then don't start this process until you are in that place where you can actively start it for the right reasons and be willing to take on all of the bits that come with it, which, as we've discussed ad nauseum over the years, is not always the fun and happy stuff. There's also some challenges and bits in there.
I think doing the workshop more than one a week would be just physically too taxing to do, because of the thinking involved and your own unpicking of your bias and understandings and further research you would need to do to feel comfortable to take on the next workshop. So I think at the very minimum, that would be 10 weeks of time. I think it's more likely to be something like 6 months of work and research to get yourself to the point to say, I can do all 10 of these workshops.
I think that would, that would almost be prudent as well, wouldn't it? Like ultimately we want you, this doesn't want to be this next quick fix thing that's out there. You actually need to sit with it and, dwell on it. And also you're going to have you're going to have all your friends go, hey, what the hell are you doing? You're a lunatic. Everyone just gets $1 million mortgage, don't you know? And I actually had someone in the last week said, when they were looking at a tiny house, which may or may not be a good solution for everyone, their comment was one of their friend group had actually said, look, I don't agree with tiny housing. Which is an interesting perspective to go, well, isn't that interesting that we need other people's validation to do what we think might be right for that person. So I was just off waxing lyrical, so you don't have to actually respond to that. I was just filling in the space.
Seamless. Thank you very much.
And then I think the last thing that we wanted to do with the introduction, or the 0.5 version, was actually a little bit try and explain how we try and use some core principles of humanity that are crucial for everyone in taking the next step. Why do you think that's important?
I guess we've spoken about safety and holding a space where we can physically come back to time and time again. So whether it's a group that forms over time and become our peers that we can bounce ideas off, whether it be the guideposts along our own individual path that we can return to and get a common sense check against in a safe way. And we've done that, some research on, how do we form agreements? And in times by, it used to be the biggest physical specimen would carry the biggest club, and therefore they were the person who was right. And thankfully, in some parts of society, we've moved on beyond that. But how do we form agreements? What are the ground rules? How do we do that? And some of that is also saying holding the space without recording and judgment in the future.
Yeah.
So we set aside the space for the here and now, but there is no recording, and we're not coming back to this in 6 months' time to second guess your particular soundbite or questions. We just hold the space for an open, safe conversation around housing to get the ball rolling. Of course, at some future point in time, there will be further content developed and recordings, et cetera, to rehash back over. But I think it's important to set those ground rules to start with.
Yeah, I agree. And I think almost, as you said, from the guidepost side of things, I almost think that there's a role for us to reintroduce maybe some stuff that is not normally used in standard communication, which is still important if we're going to facilitate a great outcome. I think the idea of us giving you some reference materials, which is, hey, we're not going to do that. We're using a collaborative operating system. We're going to discuss, ways in which you can use certain tools and decision making and those sorts of things, because we believe they're conducive with you getting a better outcome. But being aware of them is important, because sometimes this idea of moving from implicit to explicit is uncomfortable. Sometimes this idea of having meetings where everyone needs to check in is something that you're not familiar with, and if you're thinking you can hide in the shadows, then it probably is going to be a bit confronting. So you need to sort of just be aware that those are part of what we see. If you're going to be in, you got to be all in. And maybe it's the first 3 or 4 workshops that help you decide, hey, is this a path that I want to go on, or is this a path that maybe is just not right for me at the moment? And maybe that just gives you, while we're talking about the people section of it, are you really one of the people who wants to go on this journey, and what's that going to mean for you? So I think you pointed that out. I think you pointed that out as, having some guideposts or having some, almost rules of engagement that we just sort of disclose. I think that now the more I've thought about it, is a very important discussion as well.
Yeah, and if that's the tone we set at the outset, and these are the ongoing rules, I think the first couple of workshops can absolutely be delivered in a potentially an online thing. But once we get to enough trust and development of our individual group and project, that we're going to need to sit down and start to get to tin tacks in person. But I think we could potentially do in an online way, which is great from a facilitation and the tyranny of distance so long as you can get a stable internet connection, we can probably do quite a bit to get you onto the path and on your own journey.
Yeah, and I mean, even things like you've written down a few things here, which I thought would just be worth highlighting briefly before we finish off. But even this idea of declaring your own heuristics and privileges as you currently see them. Now, this is not about getting all political correct on it and using all of those things. What it is about is you being able to see yourself a bit clearer, so that if you have this lens on life, that you're just aware of it a little bit, so you don't automatically go, nah, that seems ridiculous. If you can't get to a point where you can say, hey, I maybe think about things in a certain way because of the way I grew up and my experiences in life, then that's going to be a challenge for you as time moves on, no doubt. And also, as you've said, this idea of respecting your individual self and honouring a safe and open dialogue might mean that we don't, in the early stages, we don't jump into recording stuff, because you need to be given a space that we can all feel a little bit vulnerable enough to be honest and have, truly clear and open correspondence to make that happen. So I think those things are worth having a conversation about first to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm excited to get the workshop out there when we can get it out there.
Yeah, me too. And we have been using this practice in our business for quite a few years now. So for us, it's quite second nature to have an agenda, to set up some ground rules, and to establish permission from everybody to get into these topics. And we welcome people who think this might be of interest to start with workshop 1 and see how you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll be getting out and doing this sort of as an extended version of what an introduction to the workshop series might be. But I'm hoping to get out to some Rotaries and a few other people like that. I know you are as well, just to have the conversation about, hey, this is an introduction to what our workshop series might look like. And if you can communicate that to people who might understand that, well then, hey, we'd love to speak to more people to see whether we can. And I think that's one thing I wrote down there as well, is we don't want to be involved in more talking. We want to be about change. And that's been something we're passionate about. So a little less conversation, a little more action is ultimately where we're trying to get to.
Absolutely. It's our practitioner blood and our background of actually doing it. There's that balance between an enough informed conversation to say this is good enough for now and safe enough to try. And before we roll on to waiting for perfection or a committee written report that we see too many political outcomes, that we've got thousands of reports sitting on shelves collecting dust and not actually being able to be implemented.
Yeah. That is a fantastic spot to leave us, Ro. That's perfect, mate. So I think I think this might be the first time in living history that I've actually finished in under an hour. So I think we should just all take a moment, not too long, because then I'll run overtime. No. And I really do wish to have Christine back involved, because this process couldn't have been involved without her input. So hopefully we can get the technology sorted again next week.
Yeah. Yep. Talk again next week. Thank you very much.
See you, Ray. Bye-bye.